Thank you very much. So I think you did a better introduction to me than I could have done myself. So, and definitely a better one than ChatGPT could have done with it making stuff up all over the place. So I thank you ever so much for that. And thank you for inviting me to this. I'll share my screen now so that I can just add a wee bit extra to the introduction and hopefully make sense of some things. So I think I'll probably speak for about 35 minutes. Nice to see my colleague, Professor Susan Smith there, who in fact I work with in the production of some of the resources that you're going to see today. So I thank her in particular, particularly because she has expertise in financial accounting and this whole domain, and I don't, hence the AI generated image of Socrates at a computer there. Because as you no doubt know, probably the most famous of the Socratic paradoxes, the idea of I know that I know nothing, I think is really, really pertinent to these discussions that we're having around AI. That doesn't mean that you can all turn off now and go away because I'm talking out of my hat. I think what I'm trying to say here, like a lot of people, even the computer scientists that are developing these language models and the other so-called AI tools that people are working with and discovering now from a non-computer science background and are throwing up all sorts of implications for us in higher education, not least in your discipline as well, is that we know very little about what this actually means. We know very little about how these things can be operationalized, utilized, exploited, what the opportunities are, what the threats are, what the implications are. I think they're profound, I know that much, and I am coming at this from a non-disciplinary specialist background and from a non-computer science background. But I do hope that actually I have something to offer, because my interest is broadly in digital education, broadly in program design, program development, academic development, assessment design, all of those kinds of things. So I do know that I know virtually nothing, but perhaps even the tiny something that I do know might offer something back to you, at least prompt and poke you and provoke you into further discussion. I came in at the end of the previous discussion. I wish I could have come for more, but I've stepped out of another conference to do this. So I get a sense that you're talking in the kind of area that I am. So I've got a couple of links on this first page, which if you are interested, you can access by taking your own mobile device and scanning the code, or going to menti.com in any browser window on a mobile or on the machine you're on at the moment, and entering menti.com. And once you do, you'll get a screen that asks you for a code, and that code will then bring you to the slide so you can follow the links should you want to, and also participate in my next slide, which I'm going to ask you to do. I've also put a link in the chat, so if you just click on that, you'll be able to see the slides in a slightly different format on your own machine. But it's about following the links later, and there's a link at the end to the slides if you think they're useful. You can do what you like with them. You can metaphorically tear them up into tiny pieces or repurpose them, do whatever you like if you've got a Menti account. So that's me. You'll notice on this front page that I've got a link to Midjourney. Midjourney is where I've created all of the images used in this slide. And I think that it does a really good job of highlighting some of the many issues that perhaps are more pertinent to the kind of work that we do in HE. So you look at this, I wanted an image of Socrates on a computer. You do a web search for that, you're not going to find it. But you go into Midjourney, you write the right prompt, and you get something like this. And initially, it looks great. And then you start looking a bit closer, and you notice the deformed feet. That, you know, that's no Michelangelo that's created that. That is something a bit odd. And these distortions and warpings that video generative AI and image generative AI are immediately apparent. But actually, I think they're masked a little bit in the language generators. So I think it's illustrative of what I'm talking about, but also illustrative in its own way. The first link here, I don't want to get into any arguments with anybody today, particularly anyone with a computer science background about whether this is actual artificial intelligence or not. Everyone's calling these tools AI for short, and so am I. I've written a short post here. Jean mentioned, thank you, that I do blog a lot. And this is my sort of take on why we should just carry on calling it AI, whether it is technically or not, because it is the shorthand that we're working with. So that's that. Let's see how many people are actually in the Mentimeter space by giving you an opportunity to express how you feel. You've had a chance to talk about these things this morning. You should see on your screen that you've got some sliders where on the left you can disagree completely. On the right, you can strongly agree, or you can have some sort of midpoint there as well. How anxious are you feeling? How likely do you think it is that students will cheat more because of these tools that are available? Do you think that we're going to have to change assessments in HE radically, particularly in your discipline? And are you feeling a bit positive? I'm a kind of tech enthusiast, but I also recognize that there are multiple caveats that need to go with that, not least some of the ethical issues that are being thrown up by tools that are just all over the place at the moment. Okay, so I've got 10, 11, 12 responses in, 13, that's great, 14. I'll give you a couple of moments more just to see where you sit. So what you can see on the screen there, the numbers in the boxes are the mean score. So that's the average across the room. Not quite a bell curve there, but wherever you are, see yourself in the context of other people. So if you are towards the anxiety end, you're not alone. If you're towards the, it'll be fine, with the fires burning in the bins as they roll down the river and what have you, also you're not alone. So this stuff, because it is so new, splits rooms. It's a bit Marmite-y at the moment. Love it, loathe it, use it, ignore it, ban it, embrace it. All of these kinds of things are going on at the moment as we find our feet in this undiscovered country. There is a much more likelihood of students cheating, so says the room, as a consequence of this. Might want to have an argument with you about this, because my position is I start from a position of trust. I start from an assumption that actually most students don't want to cheat. And if they do things that we consider to be illicit, illegal, against the rules, it's more likely to be to do with uncertainty about what they're allowed to do rather than deliberate cheating. So cheating implies a kind of malevolence. But actually, does it make it easier? Can they do things that they might otherwise have to pay a lot of money for an essay meal? Does that make it more likely that they'll do it? So I'm seeing the vibe in the room, and actually it's a vibe that I'm seeing in a lot of rooms. But perhaps it's something that we could dispute. I'm down this end. Nobody's at this end. I think there, even if you're ambivalent in the middle here, there is an acknowledgement that some change, maybe radically, is the thing that stopped you from going further down. But I would tend to agree there. And we've got a bit of a bell curve here, potential for positivity. Some agreeing, some disagreeing, slight tendency towards the positivity. I'm in the positivity camp, but I think that we have to be careful. So you know what we're talking about here. I'm just going to run this video in the background, but no doubt you have seen these tools in action. No doubt you've seen what ChatGPT can do. I just wanted to show you this. I recorded this video yesterday. So I asked it, something I know nothing about, to distinguish financial from management accounting and write it in an essay form. And what you can see is I've got GPT-4 running. I've got web access, should I want it. These are two new things in ChatGPT. So I pay for GPT-4 to get that extra processing power and that extra access, $20 a month. I've installed a Google Chrome extension to give it web access, which was one of the critiques before, to enable it to provide me with accurate and real URLs and references, which is one of the criticisms that was there before. And as you can see, what's happening on the screen here is it's churning out a baseline essay that might actually help me in the first instance. I reckon, I'm not going to show you the whole thing. You can watch that later if you wish. I reckon that I could probably do a basic essay at first year undergraduate level if I worked hard at it from a zero knowledge baseline using tools like this, and the fact that I've also had an education and I've got a little bit of economics experience as well. The other thing that I wanted to point out about this, though, is that when we talk about generative AI, particularly language generators, we're not just talking about generating language, and we're not just talking about ChatGPT, because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of different AI tools, often using the large language model that has been released by OpenAI, who created ChatGPT, but it isn't just ChatGPT. We're using it very often, eponymously, as a shorthand for these models, but I think it's important that we understand that this is just one way of seeing these technologies. So, for example, there's Bing Chat. Bing Chat runs on GPT-4. So if you haven't used it and you don't want to pay $20, you could sign up for a Bing Chat account. It's got the familiar to and fro chatbot style, text message style, where you ask a question, it comes up with an answer. And unlike the pure form of ChatGPT, it also offers web links out to resources. So this is a layer on. You ask questions and it offers additional sources, and you go further with that. There's also Write Sonnet, which is a suite of tools that use the same technology in the background. Write Sonnet, I think, is a little bit more canny and cynical in its approach, its targeting. They talk a lot in their background material about how their tools can get around plagiarism checks. And there's even a plagiarism checker built into their tool. So I'm writing in what looks a little bit like a word processor, but actually all of the text generated there hasn't come from my head. It's come from Write Sonnet. And it's telling me that it's 100% original, giving me confidence as a student that maybe I'm doing okay. One of the questions that appeared in chat was earlier was about the distinction between human and AI writing. And it really does get blurred when you start using tools like that. Google Bard, they've changed their interface recently, but again, I had the same question. And what it's doing here, which I thought was quite interesting, is offering me alternative drafts of the same thing as well. Similar tools, big company behind it. This one is a smaller version, but I think it really does ring some bells. Whether they're alarm bells or not is quite interesting. I would urge you to try this one. I think it's really, really quite neat. It's called Jenny.ai, and I think that when fully integrated in tools like Microsoft Office, Copilot will be doing stuff like this. So you're typing, and as you're typing, suggestions are popping up a little bit like they do in an email. And then that real blurring between authorship of the human and the AI really starts to take hold. One other one to show you briefly here. So this is a tool called Gamma.app, and it's a presentation authoring tool. And I want to show you this great presentation that I made yesterday. Here it is. Took me 2 minutes, and I generated this just by putting a prompt in, which was distinguished financial and management accounting. I don't know anything about this, but as a baseline, it's given me this presentation. It literally took 2 minutes to create this. It's a quite remarkable technology, whether that's at the level that I need it to be at, whether it's all entirely accurate, whether it's the kind of stuff that you could use. All of these questions are possibly moot, because this is the worst that this technology is ever going to be. And I can just do it like that. Even if I don't use the AI for generating this stuff, as a competitor to PowerPoint, it is quite remarkable, because there it is sitting online with a whole bunch of tools. See, I've got Edit with AI. I've got a whole bunch of other sharing and commentary tools in there that might pull me to that if I wasn't such a big fan of Mentimeter as I am at the moment. And just one final thing in this domain. I don't know if you saw this. It's only a minute long. I'll just show you this. This is where AI becomes horrific. So this is an AI video generated based around the idea of a beer commercial. And it starts off fairly normal, and then it just gets more and more and more grotesque. I mean, it's a real horror show. But actually, at the same time, whilst it's grotesque and horrible and horrific, it also is indicative of where we're at. So not only are we seeing tools that can create text, that can create images that haven't existed before, but now also video that hasn't existed before. What does that mean for us as teachers? Are we on the brink of companies being able to produce video content based on generated text that's been used to feed a presentation tool that will do a lot of teaching, that will threaten our very existence? In other words, should we panic about this? Personally, I don't think panic is the right approach. I think that we should be alert, though. So if this little AI generated monster here is looking alert, then that's probably the appropriate response. But I do think that we need to think carefully about this. Panicking is not right, because the reaction leads us to make knee-jerk decisions. Recently, we've heard that the Italian government has reopened access to ChatGPT and similar tools. I think those of us in HE assumed that it was because students would be using it for cheating and what have you. Actually, it was more to do with privacy and some of the other ethical issues that abound within this domain. But they've got reassurances now. And I think that also there is a recognition that, you know, most people can use a VPN. Most people can work around institutional regulation. There is no locking these tools down. So we have to find a way of productively working with them. But I think a lot of what we're seeing now, particularly in the experimental mode, is indicative of what we need to actually prepare ourselves for in the future. Because, as it says here, here's the robot sentinel at the gates of the university. Resistance is futile. Perhaps an appropriate phrase for May the 4th, given that it's a popular Star Trek phrase, and I know that always irritates Star Wars fans. But, you know, when I say resistance is futile, I don't mean just bow down at the knees of our robot overlords. I mean that we have to accept that this is change that is happening and that is real and that is going ahead and that is relentless. And ignoring it is something that isn't actually an option. Understanding it is much, much more important if we're going to be productive and realistic, and that our courses are trusted and viable, and that the assessments that the students are doing are trustworthy and valid for what it is that they're supposedly learning. Unfortunately, it connotes resource implications. It connotes effort. We showed collectively that we could change things virtually overnight during those periods of lockdown, during the pandemic period. We've also shown that where change is sudden and immediate but finite, we can spring back to our more traditional and conservative ways of practicing. But as I've said already, this is the worst these technologies are ever going to be. And I don't think it is an option to try and lock the doors and barricade ourselves in. So what can we do? Love it or hate it. So here we go. At the moment where we're at, I think is that there is a possibility that some people can overestimate current capabilities. There's been a lot in the media about, you know, ChatGPT passed the MBA from whatever university, or the bar exam, or it can do this, or it can do that. And actually, those kinds of headline grabbing things, I think actually are unhelpful. It takes a lot of work to engineer a situation where it's passing those exams. It isn't able to pick up a pen and write something. It isn't able to nuance things and to anthropomorphize it, and to suggest that it has human level intelligence is a nonsense that most people in the computer science world would probably agree. And At the same time, the contrasting point of that is don't underestimate the things that it does well and can improve upon. So where we see what I just showed you, videos of it generating text and pumping out what looks like an essay, actually for us, academics, teachers, and for our students, I think it's not those things actually that we could welcome into our working lives. So already I'm finding that ChatGPT and similar tools are improving my productivity. My typing is terrible. We have a marking system here at UCL where on a Mac, it doesn't include a spell check for whatever reason. And it's when I'm typing in that I realize how terrible my spelling actually is. So I'm typing away, boom, 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 banging out notes, you know, in really abbreviated form. My feedback looks like that. If I then cut and paste that into ChatGPT and say, smooth my language, correct the grammar, put it in bullets, keep the tone positive, use the second person direct form, and put it all in bulleted feedback style, it's saving me probably 10 to 15 minutes per piece of work that I'm looking at. That's a not insignificant productivity saving. It does that really well. It's also, I'm seeing with colleagues in my faculty, life sciences, an amazing labor saving thing for generating boilerplate feedback based on both prompts about the individual piece of work that's been appraised and utilization of a marking rubric. It's actually quite remarkable at doing those things. These are different to the headline grabbing, turning out an essay stuff. So I think we have to open our eyes to some of those kinds of possibilities and start playing really for ourselves. The big question, and I know you're asking this already, I just want to acknowledge it here, is that there are inevitably going to be some academic integrity issues. And how we address those will, to an extent, be disciplinary specific, but there are generalizable points, I think, across the board. We have to really start practicing what we preach at policy level about authentic assessment, about genuinely valid assessment, about variety in assessment, about challenging some of the exclusive practices that are common in restrictive, traditional, singular assessment types. And that's why I think that doing everything in person, in exam halls, paper and pen is not a viable long-term solution to this, but maybe part of a suite of responses that we do in the short term as we go ahead. But I you know, it's something that we have to think about. My view is that we need to sit aside alongside the technologies and see where they can be tools that we can use. This isn't an equal partnership. This isn't something that we should, again, anthropomorphize as I've done in this image here. We need to actually think about the ways that we can exploit the technologies and manage those technologies in the way that we've come to terms with all the other technologies that have preceded it over the last 30 years or so. And that, I think, is absolutely critical. I've got two people, I'm doing it myself. I've got a robot and I've got a person sitting side by side. Assessment, the Latin root of assessment, assidere, means to sit beside. And I think that that's really kind of emblematic of the way that I think we need to go ahead with the way that we see assessment and see changes that we might that have to employ. It is unexplored territory, so we're all learning together. So I think we as a sector need to be much better at sharing the stuff that we're doing. And we have to acknowledge some of the quite profound, actually, ethical issues. There's a link to an article that I think explores some of these really well in here. And the, you know, the sustainability issues as well. You know, the carbon footprint of the of ChatGPT when it was going through its learning phase up until September 21 is just eye-watering, and that's just on a tiny proportion of that aspect of it, which you don't really think about a lot. Well, I don't anyway, because I'm not a computer scientist, and I don't have a handle on environmental science in the depth that I would perhaps like. So we do have to think about these things. A critical ethical issue is about biases that manifest in these tools. AI learns from us. So it learns from the data that's already out there. Another way of seeing that is garbage in, garbage out. So if there are biases and prejudices in the tools or the data sets that large language models, for example, is learning from, then it will spew those out back at us, and we might wonder why it's doing that. I did generate a couple of images in Midjourney, but I thought I'm not going to include those because I don't want to offend all my colleagues that I've never met before. But I asked Midjourney to show me a room of accountancy academics teaching students. And not only were the accountancy academics all old white men, but for some reason it did them in black and white and sepia, like it's some kind of ancient profession where you only did that in the olden days, pre-1950. And it's funny to see, but it's also indicative of those inbuilt biases and prejudices in there. And we have to understand that. We have to develop our literacy in that. And we have to help our students understand that these biases exist and help them navigate their way through it. I don't actually think we collectively as a sector have done a very good job of educating our students about biases when they do a Google search or when they're engaging in social media. So I don't think this is something that's just, oh yeah, we need to talk about that. This is a major, major issue. But again, it's not just something that we can switch off. We have to look at it and find ways to challenge it. A couple of final points here. I see there's a load of stuff going on in the chat. I haven't had a chance to look at it. If people are asking questions, I'm sorry. People have suggested that the essay is dead as a consequence of this. I would be really reluctant to buy into that narrative, that argument, because the process of writing an essay is also about thinking. So producing writing, whether it's in the form of an essay or in another medium, actually is a really important part of the thinking process, the learning process, the understanding process. But actually, I've used the word process 3 times there. The product, the essay itself, is less important than the processes that go into it. And perhaps this might leverage our thinking a little, refocus us onto those processes and value them more rather than the shiny, neatly presented, unsullied essay with a nice title on there and all that. Because I think we can mask quality learning, quality understanding with a nice essay, whether it's electronic or physical. And perhaps there's scope for all of us to refocus on the processes a little bit more. Okay, nearly done. I do think that whatever the aspect that we take, we do need to critique our existing assessment practices. And I think as part of that reflective process, that dialogic, discursive process that should include students too, I think we're going to need to adapt existing assessment practices. What that looks like may vary from discipline to discipline. It may vary in the short and medium and long term. But I think it needs to happen. And I think a refocus on processes is one way that we can start to do that. This is something that Susan suggested is a real focal point for us. We need not only to be looking at the degrees that we run and the modules that we run and the courses that we run, but also to really look ahead to the ways in which AI is working its way in to business practices, accountancy practices, anything to do with financial sector. AI is already there. It's already in the way that news media is pumped out. It's already there in the way that calculations are done. It's our duty, is it not, to enable our students to find their way in those professions. we also have to accommodate the demands and the needs and the requirements of the professional bodies that we're working with. Notoriously, in some sectors, I can't speak for your discipline, but in some, they are very slow to respond. So there may be a very strong tension there between what they're demanding and asking for and what is actually appropriate, given the swift movement of these technologies and the changes in business and in employment sector. We have to acknowledge the challenge of massification in the form of large cohorts that all of us are contending with at the moment. And in particular, where we're asking students to make calculations, whether that's interpreting data in spreadsheets, whether it's actually looking at financial data and drawing conclusions from that. I think it's absolutely fundamental that we think through the implications of these things and find ways that we might make sure that our assessments are both authentic and valid, given those changes in the sector. Okay, in the slide here, I asked Midjourney to show me an accountant of the future. So no sepia-tinged white men with moustaches here, but a robot doing the accounts. Is it dystopian? I think it probably is. I also think it's unrealistic and unlikely. We need you, the world needs you, students need you, but we need to be adapting to those kinds of changes. The links are available here. These slides, if you click on this link, you'll see the presentation slides in a slightly different format. So if you do want to do that, I can just share that link again in the chat, and you can click on it even if you haven't joined the presentation. So, oops, there we go. That is me. No questions in there. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I believe that frees up about 10 minutes for any questions or comments that colleagues may have.
Thank you. That was a really interesting and engaging discussion. And personally, I'm quite enthused about some of the tools that we saw there. In particular, it's really good to know that we can use some of these tools to perhaps improve our efficiency. And you talked about the example of giving feedback to students. So I think this is all quite positive. I was on the positive end on the scale when I submitted my answers. Now I feel a bit more positive and less worried about all of this. So I think we have got 10 minutes or so left for questions. So I'm just going to see who's got a hand up. So Phil, would you like to ask a question or make an observation?
Yes, thanks. A couple of observations, I guess. As someone who was at the other end of the scale, I did start out on the positive end of the scale just after Christmas, and I've been very quickly drifting towards the other end. I think one thing that I think is really important that often gets lost in the discussion of this is there is a profound difference between GPT-4 and the older versions of ChatGPT. GPT-4 does do a really good job of passing professional level exams. I'll show some of the data in the talk this afternoon, but it can qualify, it passed medical licensing qualifications, ophthalmology, high-level postgraduate qualifications. It's very, very good at it. And it's very, very good at academic writing in a way that includes references. And I think, although most of us will be used to, and most of the academic literature at the moment will be based on the free versions of ChatGPT, I think there is a fundamental and profound difference between that and GPT-4, and that's what's really got me worried. And I think another point, again, which I'll show some data about later on, is that unfortunately, the evidence suggests quite clearly that students do cheat in quite large numbers, and a fundamental, if not the most fundamental reason why they do is that it's easy for them to do so. So in a situation where they can cheat, given the stakes and the costs and the competition, they will, just like any other human being will when faced with the opportunity to speed on a motorway, for example. And I think the key anxiety that I have about ChatGPT is it makes it so incredibly easy for students to cheat using our current assessment practices. And I don't think we really have a choice but to go back to in-person assessments. But I think a key distinction is that that doesn't mean going back to exams, but we have to assess in person, as Irene was alluding to earlier on, because if we don't, the students can use ChatGPT to pass our current assessments, and because they can, I think they will.
I can respond to that. I mean, I think I would agree with virtually everything you've said there. In-person assessments, I think we need to do a lot more in terms of interactive oral, you know, not high stakes vivas, but supporting our students to have the confidence to speak their ideas and show their working, as it were, as they're going, all of those kinds of things. Portfolio development, loving writing, all of these kinds of things, I think are options. What I don't necessarily agree with is that this has changed anything in terms of the propensity to cheat and the likelihood. If somebody wants to cheat, they can submit somebody else's work. In the past, in September last year, before anybody had heard of any of this kind of stuff at any kind of significant level. And the other thing about that as well is I think we need to really interrogate our understanding of and definitions of the word cheating here, because we're going to have to really, really think about it. We all think that we know, I think, you know, personally, we know what plagiarism is. But actually, if you get a dozen academics in the room, they'll all allow different things. We all have an idea about where our lines in the sand are. So one of my colleagues has written extensively, for example, about proofreading. So, you know, you get your brother to read your thesis and he says, yeah, it seems all right to me. Is that okay? Or you get your academic sister to read your thesis who jots a few comments in the margins. Is that okay? Or you get your professor grandfather to read your thesis who makes wholesale suggestions for changes. Is that okay? Or is that just a consequence of privilege? You know, everything is nuanced. Everything is a fine line. And not sure it's actually that helpful to label it all as cheating, though the point you make about ease of access, I think, is there. But I think we really do need to interrogate where we're at already. So using Grammarly, is that cheating? Using translation tools, is that cheating? You know, the machine learning stuff is already out there. It already exists. And for our international students, it may already be a staple of their way of producing assessments. So this is essentially catalyzing discussions we should have been having a long time ago. So broadly agree, but you know, I've got a problem with the word cheating, I suppose, from where I'm coming from.
I think that's really interesting, and I think perhaps we as a community, we often perhaps blame students a little for not really understanding what cheating is and what's the difference between maybe plagiarism and poor academic practice. But I think you're right. I think all of this perhaps should spark a debate about what actually do those terms mean, and make sure that we understand it as it's applied to all of this new technology. Does anyone else have a question or an observation? If you want to raise your hand or just come on the mic.
Just pointing something out in the chat, Rod's made a really important point about neurominorities finding AI very useful. And I think that there are opportunities here to understand that our neurotypical world and our very conservative and inflexible world is very resistant to alternative ways of seeing and doing. You know, a lot of my colleagues will say, yeah, students can present their assignments in a different format if they want. They can do a video or a multimedia presentation, but that's in a little box at the end where all the instruction is about how to write your essay. And actually, it's not a proper alternative because it's seen to be a deficit in comparison to the gold standard, which is the written word. Again, I think that these tools are helping to at least start conversations about that.
Great.
I think Joan's got her hand up, actually.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. That's very interesting. I think it was really just to follow on, and Lisa, what you'd said. I think the worry is that it's not just us, Lisa. I mean, we probably know more about what plagiarism is because we're actually teaching people. At least we're doing that, right? But it was something that Irene had in her slide earlier on, which really worries me, is decision makers being risk averse. So the people at the very top of institutions who have been out of the game and who haven't taught for maybe many years, and who actually don't necessarily want to tackle this issue, and, you know, are pushing us all for assessment. We all know that all the universities are going down the track of more and more assessment rather than exams, and they're complaining and whinging about us needing invigilated rooms.
Yeah.
Sure, that's the same for the rest of you here. They're all at it. So that would be my big concern. The leaders, the people who are supposed to be leading us, maybe they're the ones that are taking us to the cliff edge. And, you know, I really worry about that. I don't know what you think, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But 'twas ever thus. That's the thing. You know, people that have been out of the game for a long time are reluctant and resistant to the necessity for change. But I really think that there's an opportunity here to leverage positive change. You know, I've been banging on for the last 20 years about people changing their assessments and being more equitable and more fair and more varied and more authentic, and improve the validity and reliability of those assessments. And a lot of the time it feels like banging your head against a brick wall when you look up and when you look sideways to your colleagues, you know. But actually this, I think, will, you know, love it or loathe it, it's giving us an opportunity to say, okay, we really do need to start rethinking some of the entrenched 200-year-old assessment practices that are just part and parcel of what we do. Really need to think about it. And that's going to be unavoidable. So hopefully that they will soon realise.
Thanks. Sarah, I got your hand up.
Yes, I mean, sort of linked to that, in terms of the changing assessment design, is the other workload implications for people. And that's that as a sort of a head of department or you know, I'm a school education lead, director of learning and teaching. That's the bit for me which we haven't got. You know, if you're going to say to me, I've got to do potentially oral, face-to-face oral presentations of some sort for 700 or 800 students in a cohort, I haven't got capacity to do that in a, you know, in a 2 or 3, 4 week, 5, 6 week window to make it fair across the time period. So I'm struggling as to how we, you know, how we get to that point where we can put the face-to-face in, if that's what we all reckon is the potentially the better way of doing it, given the fact that we've got pressure on numbers. You've got to get more bums on seats. You know, you've got less staff doing everything, and potentially, you know, we're listening to, I was listening to the radio yesterday, chat GPT, etc., AI taking people's voices. And so therefore I could be doing a presentation or get chat GPT to listen to my voice, create the presentation and submit it as if it sounds as if it's from Sarah, but it's not. And so therefore it's got to be face-to-face if that's the case. And how do we resource that? Yeah,
it's mad, isn't it? I mean, I actually think that we can look to colleagues in other disciplines for inspiration. So, you know, I went to see the School of Pharmacy, 350 students in one day, all going through OSCEs, the you know, the in-person assessments that they do, and it's remarkable what you can achieve. And the other thing as well, I think we need to challenge our assumptions about resource implications. So, for example, if I'm going to set students a 2,000-word essay, how long does it take to create? How long does it take to assess and write the feedback and do all of that? If I then factor that into the time that I allow for interactive oral, I mean, I don't know whether you agree with this, but in my area, if I sit down with a student, ask them 2-3 killer questions in 10 minutes, I know if they know it or not. You know, it only takes 10 minutes to do that. And if I can make that more interesting, dynamic, or authentic, problem-based, whatever, I can get through quite a lot of students. And not only in that 10 minutes do I assess whether they've grasped the core concept, but I've also given them the feedback as well. So, you know, there is room and there's scope, but we have to look beyond. I mean, you look to Italian education traditions and see much more integration of oral assessment. You know, it's not like it can't be done, but I think it's very difficult to change when you're so versed in a particular discipline or a way of working. And for better or for worse, we've got a system that values the written word over everything else. But, you know, I'm just saying that we need to change that. You're right, though, about the resourcing.
Great, thank you. Parminder, I've got a question or an observation.
Yeah, a little bit of both, really. Yeah, and I think it is fascinating, and I think you're right. There is change needed, but I think it's it's going to be a huge mindset change from all levels within the institution. So that is going to take time. I totally agree with Sarah's point, because I have the same panic attacks. But one of the things that we always push, and all institutions push this, I think, is diversity of assessment. You know, we don't want to be doing the same thing. So it's not just, okay, it's got to be in person potentially. It's got to be in person with different approaches, because otherwise all of those, I go back to those boxes of skills and knowledge that were up on the screen, which were quite, very interesting, what our students should be developing as they go through higher education. So to do that, there's got to be a diverse assessment portfolio. And I think, I just have visions of staff doing nothing but assessment, and that frightens me as well.
Yeah, I agree. It's a massive undertaking, and we've got to resource it properly. And we're trying to get student interns in every department, but that's an inadequate resource. Although it's a welcome one, because this is serious. I mean, it really is serious. I think it's big. Everything will be different in a year's time again as well.
Yeah, I think the fast nature of how this is developing is adding another layer of maybe anxiety to it all, because as you say, we literally don't know where we're going to be with all this next year. Perhaps we'll be talking about it again at next year's conference. So I think we've come to the end of the time for our session. So thanks again, Martin. That was a really fantastic session. I think really thought-provoking.